Evening, everybody. Welcome to another monthly program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. Before I introduce Tony Musso this evening, on a more sobering moment, we've lost two very important people to local history in the last couple of months. Ada Harrison, who not only did a lot for the Rhinebeck Historical Society, but for the Museum of Rhinebeck History, for the Quitman Resource Center, for the Southlands Foundation, and probably a number of other organizations that I never knew about. She passed away recently, and just before her, we lost my predecessor as treasurer of this organization. She was president for some years, had worked for many years as an editor at Esquire magazine in New York City at a time when women were not in that kind of position, and came back here to Rhinebeck. She was a Knickerbocker descendant, Staley. Elma was quite a lady, and we've lost her as well. And just for those of you who were not aware of it and had spent time with them, I'm sure those memories are fond memories. So let me turn to this evening's program. Our speaker this evening is somebody who in another life used to deliver mail for the post office, and then
Never delivered.
You never actually delivered a single letter, Tony?
I was a writer editor.
Well, he made sure that the mail got properly handled, since he was an administrator at the White Plains
Well,
location.
I worked for headquarters, postal headquarters, domiciled in New York.
Okay. And he did write a book on FDR and the post office, about which he has lectured here. Has also written a book on the history of rock and roll, and more recently has come here to talk about the hidden treasures of the Hudson Valley, Volume 1, Volume 2, and maybe there'll be a Volume 3 at some point.
Well, this is
But
really
this is
the third volume in the Hidden Treasures series.
Okay. And hidden
Who
treasures.
knows where
of
I'm going to go next? Maybe the Adirondacks, I don't know.
Okay. So we're going to hear tonight
Statsburg, too.
hidden treasures of the
Oh yeah, I wrote a
Catskills.
book on
And
Statsburg.
He did a great book on Statsburg.
So Tony, we're delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you, always happy to be here. Thank you. And believe me, I don't want you to get the impression that I said, no, I never delivered mail. And the reason I say that is letter carriers have the hardest job in the post office. And I was never man enough to do it, I guess. I don't know, they got to go out in the rain. I was looking at a carrier the other day when we had the rainy day, and he's just walking around. You can't carry an umbrella, obviously. You have the sack, and he's just getting pounded with rain. And I said, whew, how I escaped that job, I don't know. Thank God for writing. No, I wrote I was the writer-editor of a monthly magazine for the Postal Service. For postal employees, 85,000 of them in the northeast corridor of the country. So that's what I did. And it was dry in the building. But I actually worked, my main office was in the building right across from Madison Square Garden on 8th Avenue, the one that's inscribed neither rain nor snow. And I never missed a day for snow. All I had to do was get to the train station, but I had some scary drives. But my office was behind the inscription, and I always felt guilty if I called in for neither rain nor snow right outside my office. So anyone familiar with the Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley books? Okay, for those of you that don't, the Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley were two books, Volume 1, Volume 2. Each one has 55 sites. But you will never see sites like the FDR home or the Vanderbilt mansion. What I do is the hidden treasures. I put things in my books that you may pass every day. An old structure from the 19th century or 18th century, and not know the history behind it, not know that George Washington set up quarters there for 6 months and had like the Fishkill Supply Depot and things of those. Those buildings are still standing. And not many people pay attention to them, but there's really a lot of history if you dig into it. So after I did the Statsburg book, I decided it was time to do another Hidden Treasures book, and I said, well, instead of doing the Hudson Valley again, I'd like to get out of the area. Well, that was the same person who was talking to himself, because I didn't realize the Catskills was as big as it is. And just to take the pictures in the book, there's 50 different sites in the book, and just to take the pictures, I had to drive to the Catskills 3 days and put 1,100 miles on my car total, just to get to the pictures. So I said, yeah, well, next I'll do Hidden Treasures of Canada. Why not? I'll put 3,000 miles on my car. But anyway, that's the focus. And similar to the Hudson, Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley, at the end of each chapter, because I try to stimulate day trips to go and look at, or a weekend trip. And so what I do is I put a physical address of each site or exact driving directions when it's off the beaten path. So that, you know, if you have a nice sunny day comes along and you want to go out for a ride, there are some sites that are in the foothill that are not very far at all. And then there's sites as far up as Schoharie. So you may want to do a weekend trip and, you know, a one-nighter, Saturday and Sunday, and see some really terrific sites. Now, I don't want you to drive that far and only have one site to look at, so I cluster the sites. So if you go into one area of Delaware County, there'll be about 5 sites you can pick from. So you might see 1 or 2 or 3 in the same day. So having said all that, that's what the book is about. We're going to start in High Falls, New York, which is considered the foothills of the Catskills Mountain. And in High Falls, you have the D&H, or the Delaware and Hudson Canal Historical Society and Museum. Is everybody aware of the D&H Canal? To tell you a little bit about it, 2 brothers, Maurice and William Wirtz, from Philadelphia, also owned a coal mine up in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, which is around the Honesdale area, or the northern Poconos, if you will. They really wanted to get their coal down to the Hudson River, because obviously if it got down to the Hudson River and they could load it onto ships and get it to New York City, they would expand their market by a lot. The other motivation that really motivated them to get this D&H Canal built was that after the War of 1812, all the coal we were getting from the United Kingdom stopped. They weren't shipping it here anymore. Ironically, the coal that was from Carbondale, Pennsylvania, proved to be more efficient and more, you know, cost effective. It was better buy than what we were getting from the United Kingdom anyway. The canal ran 108 miles. It started in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and it ended in Kingston, in an area that we know as the Rondout District. Tell you a little bit about the canal. In 1820 dollars, it cost $1.2 million to build this 108-mile canal. That was serious money in 1824 or 1823. It was kind of like Trump money today. But the Wirtz brothers did not run for president. Want to make that clear. It had 108 locks, 137 bridges, and 26 basins. Initially, the canal was 4 feet deep, and what began as just the Wirtz brothers getting their coal down to Kingston, which transformed Kingston from a sleepy farming town to a major shipping port. In fact, there were 100 people living there in 1823. By a few decades later, there were 10,000 people living in the area, and that's really what you see today when you go to the Rondout District. Those buildings all date to that period. But what happened is they started out by using it for the Wirtz brothers' coal, and then you got to figure 108 miles is a long route to come down. Other businesses along the route started paying the Wirtz brothers to load their bricks, their limestone, and other products, and they expanded their markets by getting them down to New York City. So it worked out very well. By the end of the century, railroads had taken over, and it was much quicker and more cost efficient to ship coal to New York City by train rather than putting it on a vessel, a water vessel down the river. So the D&H Canal shut down. That said, since it was 108 miles, much of it was planted, you know, they filled them in and they made farms out of them and everything else, but there's still scattered remnants all along that 108 mile in various towns. Cuddlebackville has some, obviously High Falls has some, and along the route you could see the ruins of these. Where High Falls came in is there are 5 locks that were built in 1847, 20 years after it opened. And the reason they built the 5 locks through, they were connecting locks, built them through High Falls is they wanted to build locks that could handle bigger boats rather than the narrow canal boats. And so the 5 locks that still exist in High Falls are 90 feet long, 15 feet deep, and 15 foot wide. And then they would get them down and somehow transport them by wagon or whatever from there to Kingston, which wasn't that far of a ride, because High Falls is just beyond Rosendale, if you know where that is. In 1968, the D&H Canal property in High Falls was designated a National Historic Site. Well, 2 years prior, the citizens of High Fall had created the D&H Canal Historical Society, and they set up a museum in this building. It's a former Episcopal church that was built in 1885. So this building itself is a historic building to begin with. And actually, I gave a lecture in the main church part, I think it was December of last year when the book first came out. They have a wonderful museum in there. They have scale models of the canal, and when he turns the pump on, the gates will open, the canal boat floats in, and then you can see the boat rise up so it can get into the next lock. It's really nice, and it really worked out well for me because I just got back from the Panama Canal. So having all those things, I saw it on a much larger scale. But it's a very interesting museum, and they only, I believe they charge $3 to get in, and that's another focus of the book. You know, we could spend $16 or $20 to get into the mainstream tourist sites. I try to keep the sites in my book either free, run by a historical society where there's a jar and you put a couple of dollars in, or, you know, it's nominal, like a $3 or a $5 admission. In 2014, the Society received a substantial grant from New York State, and they're in the process of renovating this building, which some of you might remember in High Falls. This is the 1797 Depew Canal House, which was a restaurant for many, many years. They went out of business 2 years ago. The museum is going to relocate probably late 2017 into this building. And the advantage is obvious. They're now going to have 2 full stores. They have a lot of things in storage. So you'll be able to go on both floors, see the museum, and then the beginning of the 5-lock walk is right here. It's right next to the building. Now the 5-mile walk, what they did was when it was designated a historic landmark, the society went out and they cleaned the paths. The canals always had mule riders. They worked for the canal, and they had a rope connecting to the canal, and they would guide and accompany the canal, the boats all along the canal route. Right across, right about here is the entrance to the 5 canals. They're dry right now. Even more of an advantage because you can look in and see all the mechanisms of the gates that would open and everything. Everything's right out in the open for you to see. People say, you know, and that's free of charge, by the way. And people say, you know, well, how many locks can you walk? You can walk the whole 5 because they've refurbished and graded the whole path, so it's very level. It's gravel. In June, I found out while I was writing the book, the Society has a special program twice in June where they call it Wine Day at the 5 Locks Walk. And as you go on, you have to pay for that, but as you go to every lock, you get a couple of glasses of wine and they have snacks out there. So I've walked the whole 5, but it's not gonna happen on Wine Day. I'll be around 3 and I'll be, okay, let me sit down, can I have another glass of wine? But it's an interesting concept, and you get to see a really neat part of history in the area. I have the Rondout District in my Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley book, but I really wanted to put this in the Catskill book as the foothills. Now this is along 213, Route 213 out of Rosendale. If you go to the very west part of 213, you're going to come to a T-bone intersection. That's Route 209. If you go north, you're going to Kingston. If you go south, you're going down to Ellenville, down in that area. If you take that road and make a right-hand turn and head north, the next foothills of the Catskills site is in Hurley, New York. Anybody been to Hurley? Okay. In 1662, a group of Dutch and Huguenot settlers arrived in New Dorp. That's what the settlement was called at that time. New D-O-R-P, the community's original name. Because its original inhabitants, the Esopus Indians, didn't really care for the settlers intruding on their property, they did burn down all the houses in New Dorp and then went up to Kingston and did some damage up there. Well, the houses were quickly rebuilt, and this time, instead of putting wooden structures up, they learned their lesson. So all the structures there on Main Street are all stone houses. So they quickly rebuilt them, and in 1664, the settlement fell under British control. At that time, the British governor was named Francis Lovelace. He changed the name from New Dorp to Hurley, but it was spelled H-O-R-L-E-Y, and the reason he named it that was his ancestral home in England. It was later changed, after we won the war, it was later changed to Hurley with a U, and that's how that name changed. The 9 stone houses that were originally erected along today's Main Street share the same characteristics. They're 1.5 stories tall, moderately pitched roofs, and they're all constructed of Ulster County limestone. This house here is the Van Etten Dumont House, and it's the oldest in the entire town of Hurley. In fall 1777, the Continental Army was housing in the basement dungeon all their prisoners that they were gathering during the war. One of those prisoners was British Lieutenant Daniel Taylor, and he was a spy that was captured by the Continental Army. Now, because of that, this house is also referred to this day as the Spy House. Now, you know those blue historic markers that are on the road whenever you see historic sites? There's one, it's hidden by this bush right here. And if you read it, it says this is the Van Etten Dumont House, also known as the Spy House, and they say from this location, British Lieutenant Taylor was put on a horse and taken down the road, and he was hanged, and he died. Well, that's true, but not exactly true, because in doing research for the book, I found out that they did take him out, put him on a horse, because he was a spy and he was tried and found guilty. But as soon as they pulled the noose around his neck, he had a heart attack and died on the horse. So I guess in a way that was more merciful than hanging from a tree. But the Historical Society lady that was taking a bus trip that I did for Mount St. Mary's College of the area, she said, "Really? I'll have to check on that." And the next week we came back with another group, and she said, "I checked, you were right." And I said, "Well, you have to redo the sign." That same year, to escape the attack of the British, you know, when the British came up the river and they broke the chain and they got to burn down what is now called the Stockade District in Kingston. Well, Governor George Clinton was the first governor of New York State. And what he did was he fled to Hurley during the attack of the British. And in this building right here, this building for 6 months served as the New York State Capitol. And he ran the Capitol out of here until the British completely cleared out, and then they moved it back and repaired the buildings and moved the Capitol back to Kingston before it went to Albany. So this was the New York State Capitol building. The Polly Crispell House, which is right here, there's a path right next to it, and it looks like a private driveway, a gravel driveway, but there is a sign that plainly tells you it's a public path. And if you walk past Polly Crispell's cottage and past her barn that was built in the late 1700s, you'll come to the old cemetery of Hurley. Now that sits adjacent to the Esopus Creek. It's open to the public dawn to dusk. You can go in there. And it's a lot of bluestone, those really old rounded top gravestones in there. The oldest one belongs to that of Captain Matties Tenyek, who died in 1741. So it's kind of a neat little place to walk through and see some of these old, because a lot of the old stones that they put up had artwork on them too. And so it's an interesting place to go to. Also available if you go to Hurley is on the west side of Main Street. It lines right up with Main Street, is the Reformed Church of Hurley, which was built in 1853. They leave that open dawn to dusk 7 days a week. So you can also visit that church. And then right across the street from this house here is another stone house, and you can see how they're all stone houses on Main Street. And the Historical Society took that house over, and they have a museum in there. And the advantage of the museum is not only to look at the artifacts in the museum, but they offer walking tours on weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays. And you may be able to get into one of the two of the houses. They have arrangements with the people. When I took the bus tour up there that day, we got into this house and the Spy House with the bus trip. And they really enjoyed it because they kept it pristine. They didn't modernize anything. And it's actually, you're seeing what was the state capitol at that point. Also, again, in June, I believe it's the second weekend in June, Saturday and Sunday, I think they charge you $12. I'm pretty sure it's $12. And they call it Hurley Stone Day, Stone House Day.
July.
It's July?
July.
Thank you. The second weekend?
It's usually around 4th of July.
Well, it's not on the holiday, I know that.
No,
It
but
must be.
it's around the weekend.
Yeah, okay, the weekend after, yeah. You get to go in all the houses. These are all privately owned right now, but the people open them up, and if you really want to get a really nice look of what it was like back in the 1600s, 1700s, these houses will show you. Now we're going to go up 209 further towards Kingston, but when we get to 209, we're going to make a left and go west. That is Route 28, goes up past Woodstock and all up that way. And that's one of the routes that I take you on. I take you up 28, 23, 23A, and 97 out of Port Jervis up to Narrowsburg in Sullivan County. But we're going to stop in Phonecia for the next site. And this is the Phonecia Railroad Station, which was built in 1899. It's one of three largest stations that were on the line serving the Ulster and Delaware Railroad. It was a critical hub, this one right here, because this was the only one that had a track that went by from Kingston area, went by and kept going west, and the last stop was Oneonta. In fact, that was the same design, same size, was the end of the line. Or you can get off your train over here at Phonecia, and they had a hub track that switched back and went north, and you can get up to Hunter Mountain, Tannersville, Haynes Falls, and that area was filled. There were no resorts at that time. There wasn't a Borscht Belt or anything going on, but you had boarding houses, you had bungalow cottages, things of that, and people would take the stub hub up north. So that was very, very important. The only thing they had to do was the stub track that went up north was a narrow gauge track, so they did have to rip all the track up and replace it with standard gauge so that the trains can do that. The busiest season for tourist travel here at the Phonecia Railroad Station was 1913, and the figure I'm going to give you now, I referenced and checked it 3 times, and it came out the same. In 1913, 675,000 passengers were handled at the Phonecia Range because of that hub, or you can go to Oneonta. And many people went to Phonecia itself because they were beautiful restaurants. If you've never been to Phonecia, that would be a great place to stop for lunch. There's a lot of 19th century buildings and restaurants now. Very good restaurants. During that era, Phonecia Railroad Station was featured in a one-reel silent black and white motion picture, and the title of the film was The Holdup of the Rocky Mountain Express. Once again, Hollywood did it. They duped the public, And while you thought you were watching, a railroad get held up in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, it was right here in Phonecia. Every exterior scene was done on the stub track going north, not to interrupt the regular line. And all the interior shots were done in the Phonecia Railroad Station. Now, the Phonecia Railroad Station had 2 waiting rooms and the ticket window in the middle of both. And I was always confused, because I said, why do you need 2 waiting rooms? Why, Grand Central is one big waiting area. But the problem was that the men used to like to smoke, and that was offensive to the women. So they would stay in one waiting room and the men would stay in the other one. Now, when passenger service ended in Phonecia in 1954 and freight service ended in 1976, so that was the end of the line. The other big station other than Oneonta and Phonecia was in Shandaken. That was built in 1907. They immediately tore the station down when the line went dormant. The one in Oneonta, which was built a year after this in 1900, was purchased. They didn't knock it down. It was purchased by a businessman, and it still stands today in Oneonta. Same shape and everything, but it's a retail store. They kept it as a retail store. The one in Phonecia was going to be torn down right after Shandaken, but a man in town named Jack Ham was a railroad buff, and he said, there's no way we're going to lose this gem. This was an important part of their history. Railroads were an extremely important part of the Catskill tourist industry, which started way before the Borscht Belt. He bought the building but never did anything with it. He just let it sit there. In 1985, the nonprofit Empire State Railway Society purchased this station, and after a complete restoration inside and around the tracks and everything else, they opened the Empire State Railroad Museum. So you can go up there from May to October on Saturdays and Sundays, see all the original artifacts. Many of the things you're going to see were in use in this station when it was in its heyday. And also there is a tourist line now that comes up from Kingston, and it comes into, so it's still a working railroad station, only today it's a tourist line from Kingston up to Phonecia. So a pretty neat place to visit. Now if you continue going west on Route 28 and you make a right-hand turn in Arkville, there's Route 30 that goes north, you're going to come to the town of Roxbury. And in Roxbury, I give exact directions how to get here because it's on an off-road, and I tell you exactly how to get to the place. You will find Woodchuck Lodge. Now, in my Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley book, I did a chapter on slab sides, which was the rustic cabin built by John Burrough, American naturalist and writer, in 1895. He built the cabin 1.5 miles in the woods from his estate right on the Hudson River, and he would live there from April to November. And in November he would come back to live with his wife at the estate till April. They had a very long marriage. It's really good. And I got the spotlights, I hope, when I get home, because I'm finishing my cabin tonight, but I'm putting heat in mine. But that's the only reason he went back in November, was he had no heat in the cabin. So I thought it would be interesting in the Catskills book to show where John Burrough was born and raised, and that was in Roxbury. This was the family farm. He was born here in 1837 on the family farm, and at 17 years old, he left to attend the Cooperstown Seminary. He wasn't going to be a minister. In those days, they called a lot of schools seminaries. He took up the teaching profession. And when he graduated the Cooperstown Seminary, he got a few local jobs, and then he actually moved to Illinois. He was offered a job in Illinois as a teacher. That said, he moved back to New York in 1857 on his 20th birthday to marry and start a family. To support his family while he started his writing career, because we all know writers are poor. That was a joke. To support his family, he took jobs as a federal bank examiner, and later he moved to Washington, D.C. to become a clerk at the Treasury Department. Now that was a very important move for him to make, not so much for the job, but while he was in Washington, D.C., he met and became lifetime friends with Walt Whitman. and that was a very important connection for him. In 1874 is when he came back and purchased a 9-acre pig farm in Westport and transformed it into his estate with a beautiful big stone house, mansion, which still exists there, by the way. His descendants live on there today. As his career flourished, his writing became required reading in schools nationwide, and he was a well-known lecturer. By 1910, Burrough and his family began to spend the summers at his family farm, specifically using this lodge that his brother Curtis built in 1860, and it was on part of the family farm. It's a 2-story, 3-bay house consisting of 3 bedrooms. There's 1 downstairs and 2 upstairs. And Burrough immediately added a Franklin stove to the dining room and furnished the dwelling in typical camp style. Has anyone visited Slabsides when it's open? It's open in May and October. Then you know he built all the furniture inside, and it was very rustic, and he did the same in this lodge. In fact, he also built this porch, so the furniture looks very much like the porch. He collected sticks and lumber along his daily morning walk around the property, and he believed in reusing these, you know, for other purposes. He named the house Woodchuck Lodge, and that was a reference to the rodents that became frequent visitors during the summer when he was here with his family. While riding home in 1921, because he started, as he got older, he started spending winters in California. The cold was really getting to him. So in 1921, while he was on a train coming back home from California, he died on the train at 83 years old. He was buried on the farm just west of the lodge, and this is his gravesite. He always wanted to be buried by Boyhood Rock, which is right here. He spent an awful lot of time on this rock when he was a child. This is his gravesite. And believe it or not, this little area, small as it is now an official New York State park. So if you pull your car there, you could walk it from the lodge, but if you care to, you can pull your car there. And they have about 6 or 7 spaces, and there's a lot of placards on the ground before you get to his grave that tell you all about his career. It's pretty interesting. It's usually very quiet and peaceful. This Boyhood Rock, I said he played a lot on it as a child. Well, it was a working farm, and while his siblings were out doing all the chores on the farm, much to Burrough's father's chagrin, he used to sit on this rock and read books all day, which his father thought was a total waste of time when the chickens needed tending to. So that's where he wanted to be buried, and that's where he was buried. In 1973, his great-grandnephew donated the entire property, including the gravesite, the lodge, and all the property that belonged to the Burrough family, to a nonprofit group that continues to maintain the house. They take care of it. They take care of the grounds here. And they open it up every Saturday and Sunday free of charge. So with this one, I put a website. Whenever there's a website or a telephone contact number for a historical society, I put it at the end of the chapter because they do have events on several weekends during July and August. And you might want to plan your visit for when something's going on there. They have guest speakers on occasion, and you get the tour of the lodge and everything. But a pretty interesting place to visit. Now, I said I cluster sites, so you don't drive all the way up here to see Woodchuck Lodge. If you get back on Route 30 from here, which is, a couple of 100 yards, you'll come up to another T-bone intersection. That is Route 23. If you make a right-hand turn and you go east just 5 minutes, you will come to this place, and this is Zadock Pratt's house. So who's Zadock Pratt? Well, he was a tanner and a saddler by trade, and he built this house in 1828, and when it went up, it was the most prominent in the town. And by the way, that town, he did so much for that town that in later years, it was named for him. It's Prattsville, New York. Pratt had earlier opened the Prattsville Commercial Building, which was a large tannery operation, which sits on the corner just out of view of the house. It was 500 feet long, this building, and 43 feet wide. And you have to imagine this was extremely, extremely rural area in 1820s, 1830s. So when that building opened, he needed so many employees that people were flooding to Prattsville when they got the news that there were jobs waiting for them up here. To accommodate them, Pratt even built 100 workers' homes that lined the street on both sides of his facility there. The population just went through the roof in what became Prattsville. He also sponsored the construction of 100 workers' houses, which are built using leftover hemlock lumber from the tannery. So he was into recycling before it became fashionable. In 1856, during a major renovation of the house, a former 1843 Greek Revival style bank building, which is right here, was attached to his house. He had guest quarters up top, and for a while he used it as a tavern. So it had a side door so as not to disturb the family in the house here. A number of other irregular and asymmetrically placed wings were also added to the house, and it might not look like a big house, but it goes very, very far down the drive, today's drive that they put in. Today it is used as a museum, the Zadock Pratt Museum, which has a lot of artifacts related to his tannery operation and the many projects he had through the years while living here. Being very influential in the town, Pratt was appointed without getting any legal training at all, by the way. He was a tanner. He was appointed Justice of the Peace and Foreman of the Grand Jury in town. In 1836, he was elected Congressman of the 8th Congressional District. And in 1842, he established the Prattsville Advocate, which was the first weekly newspaper ever to come out in that vastly rural area. He also donated land across the street from his house and a little further east, and paid for half the cost of building the Prattsville Academy, which was by far the most prestigious school in this whole area. In 1843, an unemployed laborer saw Zadock Pratt walking around his house here, and he approached him for a handout. You know, he's unemployed, he was out of luck. Well, Zadock Pratt was a great benefactor and he loved helping people, but he wasn't much into welfare. And so what he did was he said to the fellow, well, what do you do for a living? And the fellow said, well, I'm a stone cutter. Well, Zadock Pratt immediately pointed from the house up to a cliff that overlooked his 350-acre farm. And he said, I will hire you and pay you every week, and I would like you to carve on the cliff of that mountain my life story. I never said he was modest. Actually, I'm talking to my son about doing that on our break wall by the house. It's a short story, so it's not going to be. Anyway, this is just a very small portion of that rock that was engraved with all the things. Now, this is a profile of Zadock Pratt. His son's profile is here. The stonecutter even gave himself a nod by putting the hammer and the sickle in his hand. This is a very small part. I went up there in March to photograph it, and also I'll add right now, I don't think they were originally painted white. I think whoever in the town wanted them to show up so you could see what they look like, and so they were painted white later on. But I couldn't get to the cliff on the other side because there were so many trees in the way, you wouldn't have been able to see anything I was taking a picture of. You can't see it when you're up close, but with all the twigs in front of it, it wouldn't have had the same impact. This was the clearest part. The funny thing is, it's about a quarter of a mile to a half a mile from Zadock Pratt's house, and it's now called Pratt Rock Park. It's a municipal park. They have about 10 or 12 parking spaces. And I pulled into the space, and I was on a time schedule the 3 times I went up for pictures because I had gauged what sites were on what side, north or south of the street, and I wanted the sun coming down, and so I was on a strict timeline, and I thought I was going to park my car, get out, walk up the steps to the pavilion where there's a sign that tells you all about it, and then just go and take the picture. stupid on my part. It's on the cliff, which is 1 mile up on a switchback trail. It's an easy trail, believe me, it is an easy trail. It's a switchback trail, but it is 1 mile in length till you get to the top. Well, I had other places to go, so I ran the trail with my camera, got to the top, and even though it was March, I was drenched, you know, but I had to do what I had to do. So I took this picture and then ran back down the trail, got in my car and went off to the next site. But if you do go up there, you can easily walk up the switchback. It's not steep at all. It's a very easy grade to walk. Now this site I found by accident, and I ended up putting in a book while I was out exploring out in the Catskills and everything. This is in East Meredith. We're now getting into the real northwest part of the Catskills right now. In 1860, David Hanford purchased this 1846 sawmill, and it's in Delaware County, the most northern part of it, and he enlarged the complex to include a grist mill. In 1881, he expanded the technology available by adding a steam engine, and he harnessed the waters in the Cornwright Creek, which run right behind the mill back here, before the tree line. And by doing that, he provided the town of East Meredith with its first electricity ever. And this was way ahead of his time, so I mean, he was a pretty brilliant guy. The mill became the primary source of income for local men. During the late 19th century, he turned it over to his two sons, Horace and Will Hanford, and they started overseeing the operation. In 1910, they built the Hanford Brothers hardware store. Now you talk about ahead of time, this is 1910. You could go into the Hanford hardware store and you could buy whatever you wanted, but they had a book there with 6 designs, 6 different houses. And what you would do is you would pick one of the models out and say, you know, this is the model I want on my property. And they would sell you every nut, screw, wood, lumber, shingles, whatever you needed to put the house up. Now, if you're a guy like me, who is useless with tools, they're actually all locked up in my house. My son will not let me touch his tools because I have a habit of breaking things. I can't help it. They would send a crew out for an additional charge to build the model house that you picked. That was way ahead of its time, especially in this rural area here. You know, today we have Williams and we have Page, and they might have professional help in helping to design a house, but we're talking 1910. In 1925, the brothers erected a steel water mill at the intersection with the intention of generating more water power, but they gave up that idea and they've used this ever since to store grain. A man named Frank Pizza, notice I don't have trouble with that name, Musso, Pizza, it all goes well. He was a mill employee for many, many years, and in 1945 he purchased the entire complex, and that ended the 85-year Hanford era. He hoped to expand the facility by using state-of-the-art technology in 1940s terms, but because the World War II had just ended and thousands of troops were coming back home, there was a little decline in the economy there, and he didn't get the financial support that he wanted, so he couldn't go forward. That said, he kept the place running, the whole complex running, until 1967, when it was shut down. In 1973, New York State chartered the Hanford Mill Museum, which provides visitors with an unrivaled perspective of an authentic 19th century mills. There are more than a dozen buildings on this site that date to all the way back to 1846, and all the buildings that were put up after. You have the mill pond and water wheel that you could visit, and on weekends what they do is they have every operation that was there, the sawmill, the grist mill, they have people demonstrating how all these skills are done. So it's actually a working place when you go in there and tour the whole grounds. Also in July and August they have a lot of kind of upscale events and functions to draw people in. They have like the Mountain Man, you know, they race to chop down a tree, and they have all these competitions. it was a really, really neat site when I walked it. Actually, it was closed because, again, I was here in March sometime, and it was closed down, but the woman came out of the house who now runs the property, and she walked me around and everything. So you could spend definitely a half a day on the property, if not more, if they're having those other functions going on. Okay, the next site we're going to go to is a very interesting site, because remember I told you I was on a schedule when I ran up the hill at the Pratt Rock? Came back to my car, and the very next spot I had to get to was this spot. Mount Utsayantha. With my Brooklynese, I practiced that word 50 times so I wouldn't offend anybody. It's an Indian name. And Utsayantha was an Indian maid. Her father was the chief of the tribe. Why this and the lake below it are named after her is when she was a child, she loved to climb up here, and she used to love to use the lake. To give you the Reader's Digest version, it's much longer in the book, Utsayantha fell in love with a white man, which is a great taboo, especially to her father, who was the chief. Well, they ran away because they knew something bad was going to happen. Well, 25 or so, well, it wasn't 25, it was probably 5 years later, some of the people in the tribe reported back to the chief that they found where they were living and that they had an 18-month-old son. So he got word back to them, look, all is forgiven. I'm old now. I would like to see my grandson and this and that. They agreed to come back and visit him. And when they came back to visit him, and their tribe was settled right on the side of the lake, it was all a ruse. The chief killed her husband, and then had two of his tribesmen take the 18-month-old baby in the middle of the lake and throw him over. So it's like a soap opera drama. Well, Utsayantha was so grief-stricken, she took a canoe out the next day and jumped over in the same spot her son was dropped, and she died. They recovered her. They carried her up to the mount, which is now named in her honor, and they buried her in a cave on the part of this mountain. She has never been found. So any explorers in the crowd, if you go to this site, you might find the Utsayantha gravesite. But, you know, fire towers always intrigued me when it came to the Catskills. They have a very good history behind them, and let me go through part of it. The 700,000-acre Catskill Park was established in 1885, and one of the first priorities of New York State was to battle forest fires. They at first assigned fire wardens that would walk all the tracks of the railroads, because, you know, with the sparks flying off the engines and everything, they would catch on the brush, and all of a sudden you lost 100 acres. You know, it happened that fast. Well, despite the good work the fire wardens were doing, they had two huge fires, one in 1903 and another one in 1908. Desperate for a solution, the New York State Forest, Fish, and Game Commissioner from Albany reached out to his counterpart in Maine. Maine was having a lot of good luck putting these fire towers up. And what they did was they had one ranger positioned up here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and living in a tent at the bottom of the tower 12 months a year. So imagine being there tonight in a tent on the top of this mountain. Well, eventually they conceded and built these little, that's only the roof of it. It's a little kind of a cabin that they can go into the cabin in wintertime, and they had, you know, heat in there and everything for them. So what happened was the first one that was put up in the Catskill Mountains was in 1909, and that was on Hunter Mountain. And that tower was made of wood. In 1934, they built this structure on top of Mount Utsayantha, and it was made of steel. This is also in the town of Stanford, Delaware County, to give you a rough idea of where we are. By the 1980s, there was no longer a need for these fire towers, because there were so many planes flying over the Catskill region that if they noticed a fire going out, they just radio it in, and maybe they'd lose 5 acres instead of 100. And that worked well. This tower was finally closed down in 1989, and today the whole summit of this mountain is a village park, the village of Stanford Park. Now mind you, I'm coming from Pratt Rock. I'm drenched. I get here and I go halfway up the mountain, and there was a spot for 8 cars. So I pulled my car in and parked it, and I went to the ranger's office, and it was locked. There was no one there. The lights were out. So I walked back just past my car, and there were 2 trails. The one on the left said, hiking trail 1 mile to the top. Well, that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to run up another trail around this mountain. So I looked at the next sign, and it said recommended for 4-wheel drive vehicles. And I turned around and looked at my Acura, and I said, guess what? You are a 4-wheel drive vehicle. So I went up. It's like red clay, that route. And you can imagine from Jeeps going up in wet weather, there were ruts in the road. But I made it all the way to the top in my Acura with no problem at all. I did 10 or 15 miles an hour, winds around the mountain, and I got up to the summit. Now, if you're going to go out to the site and visit, and believe me, it's worth it, because this is always open, so you can get right up in that tower, and the views from up there are incredible, really incredible. But I want to warn you, if you go up the road with the car, it's very safe. Trust me, I wouldn't send you up there if it wasn't, but there's no railing. So don't look down. Just keep moving at 10 or 15 miles an hour. I kept putting my radio louder, and suddenly the radio, the static took over, and I didn't have a radio anymore, so I had to hum to myself. But I wouldn't look over. But it's wide enough, you know, it's more than wide enough for a car to get up there. But this is a terrific place to visit. And obviously it's free, it's a village park. We're going to go to the furthest site in the northwest part of the Catskills, believe it or not, in Schoharie, which I didn't even think was part of the Catskills, but in fact there's quite a few sites up this way. And that is the old stone fort in Schoharie. In 1772, a High Dutch church, this one, was built by Palatine settlers. Now, approximately 3,000 German Protestant refugees made a deal with the British. In return for their free passage to New York, and they settled in Germantown, they would support the Royal Navy by working on different things to support the Navy. Well, that project fell apart very quickly, and some of the Palatine refugees were given parcels of land as far away as Schoharie. So they had this piece of land, and they built this in 1772. When the Revolutionary War was going on, even though this is way up there, this was very vulnerable to attacks by the British, because they were associated with the Iroquois Indians, and you had them running around and supporting the British, so nobody was safe. The church stopped working as a house of worship, and they put a half-mile stockade fence around it, and they made it into a fort instead of a church. Now, when the British came and they destroyed neighboring communities on both sides of this one here, they tried to get over the stockade fence and destroy the church, but don't forget, they were getting firepower from the troops stationed in the fort, and they never made it over. However, if you go to the south side of the other side of the building, this is the main entrance, to this day there's a cannon hole in the wall that they never repaired. So they lobbed a cannonball in there, but I guess the fence had kept them at such bay that they really couldn't do much damage, but the cannon hole is in the back. When the Revolutionary War ended, the stockade fence was removed, and this went back to being a church. They had worship services and everything going on here. In 1844, when 2 newer Reformed churches were built in nearby communities, they closed this down and they sold it to New York State for $800. The state removed the belfry, which was here, and they extended the tower by 9 feet. In space formerly used as a church balcony, like the choir loft right here, they extended the floor right across to make it a 2-story structure. And this was used through the Civil War up to 1873 as a militia armory. So it's got a lot of different purposes. Now, the Schoharie Historical Society was founded in 1889, and the state tasked them with creating a museum, a two-story museum in this building on the history of the area. But because they were like the Dutchess County Historical Society, they were the Schoharie County Historical Society, they started bringing in buildings from all over the county. They brought in a wooden toll gate that used to have to pay the toll, and the toll gate, he would lift the wooden gate up. They brought in a one-room schoolhouse, a law office, and they even have a perfectly preserved Palatine barn on the property. So there's a lot to see up here. And then just past the building and up the road, there's a covered bridge. So there's a lot to see in the area. It is a ride. It took me 2 hours, 40 minutes to get up here on a straight run. So if you wanted to do that, see something, and then see another thing in this area, there's a couple of in this area that I clustered, and then stay overnight, you can make a weekend out of it. Or you can just come back home after seeing 2 or 3 sites. Now operating for 126 years, the museum still welcomes visitors to view exhibits and artifacts from the fort's heyday, and welcomes them to access all the other buildings that are on the site. They're just left open, so if you didn't want to go in the museum, you could just go visit all those other sites. We started with, 3 hours ago, we started with the D&H Canal. And I thought it'd be really appropriate to end with the D&H Canal, but a very unique part of it. This is Roebling's Bridge. It's located in Minisink, New York. It's 23 miles north of Port Jervis. Now, this is an absolutely wonderful, if you go to Port Jervis on I-84 and you get off at exit 1 and you start driving north, you're going to be on Route 97, which borders the Delaware River. It's one of the most beautiful sights. In fact, if you go in the foliage season, you're not going to want to come home. It's just beautiful. That's Pennsylvania on the other side. This is New York. This is a 535-foot wire suspension bridge known as the Delaware Aqueduct, or simply Roebling's Bridge. It was erected over the Delaware River in the 1840s as part of the D&H Canal. Now you're looking at this and you're probably thinking, you know, it's a neat bridge to drive across and walk across. This was filled to the top with water. I'll tell you what happened. The original D&H Canal came out on low ground, and they then had to cross the Delaware River to reconnect with the canal on this side. The problem was that there were timber rafts coming down at a high rate of speed because there's a little bit of rapids there. And so you had a cluster backup of canal boats here waiting for an opening, or if one tried to get across and a timber raft came down faster than they thought, there was a bad collision. And, you know, the people that are on the canal boat operating it, you know, there's serious ramifications. In 1846, a man named Russell Lord proposed the construction of a bridge over the river to provide an unrestricted route for canal boats. So they moved the D&H Canal to higher ground, and now this part was the whole D&H Canal, just filled right up to the top with water. On both sides, this side and the north side of the bridge, there were lumber hangovers, and that's where the mules with the employees of the canal would walk along and accompany the bridge across. This bridge, along with the D&H Canal, closed down in 1899 when the whole canal shut down. And what they did was a fellow named, let me get his name here, I'm losing my place, Charles Spucks came along and he bought this bridge. They didn't know what he was going to do, but they needed it sold, and he sold it. Charles Spucks had people go out and take down, because he was afraid as these paths for the mules deteriorated and fell into the river, they could likely hit a boat that was passing underneath, and he didn't want any damage. The second thing he did was he put strategically placed holes in the bottom of the bridge, and they drained all the water out, drained it down to nothing. And what he did was, in 1900, he put a toll house on the New York side, and he turned it into a vehicle and pedestrian bridge for traffic. Believe it or not, it remained this way. In other words, if you came from Pennsylvania, came to the New York side, Mr. Spucks would come out, he would collect your toll, and he'd manually pick up the wooden gate so you could get into New York. If you were coming from New York wanting to go to Pennsylvania, he just did the same thing. Took your toll, lifted the gate. Believe it or not, this operation lasted from 1900 until 1980. Pretty incredible. I wish I knew about it years ago because I would have done it just to do it. Anyway, in 1980, the National Park Service comes along and they buy the bridge and the toll house. And now you can go across the bridge to Pennsylvania or vice versa. The toll house is now a museum. The bridge is free. And I have to tell you, if you want to walk across the bridge, it's a very narrow bridge, but it's very safe because no one, and I even found myself, you're driving through, it's so high over your head, both sides, that you're only doing 5 or 10 miles an hour getting across there. So it's really safe. There were people walking on the bridge when I was going across it, but you don't dare go 30 miles an hour because it's just so imposing on both sides of you. Like I said, they opened this up as a museum, so you can go in there and see the artifacts of the original thing. Its 2 suspension cables, originally installed in 1847, were replaced in 1985 after 150 years of use. The 1 mile span is now open, like I said, to both vehicle and foot traffic. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you, this is not a hidden treasures of the Catskill, but I do have a blurb at the end of this chapter in the book. If you go across the bridge, remember I told you I like to give you 3 or 4 places to visit on a day trip. If you go across this bridge, and as soon as you get in Pennsylvania, you make the first right-hand turn, you go about a half a mile down, and you will come to Zane Gray's house. It's in Pennsylvania, so it's not, I couldn't do a whole chapter on it. It's not in the Catskills. But if you're so close, the National Park Service owns that, and that is free too. They give you a tour of the Zane Grey house, which includes original manuscripts, exhibits, and memorabilia that belong to Gray. If you don't know, familiar with Zane Grey, he was a very great Western novelist. He wrote a lot of Western stories. Now, if the name Roebling sounds familiar to you, he went on in 1883 to build the Brooklyn Bridge, which linked Brooklyn to Manhattan. And that bridge has been sold many times. When I was living in Brooklyn, that bridge got sold once a week.
Tony, thank you enormously.
And thank you.